The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Kathy Little. I'm the Client Relations Manager here at PRODUCTSPACE. Our Quick Bites topic today is designing a secure user authentication framework for Windchill, which will help you improve the overall level of security for your PLM environment. Also, we are interested in hearing about any challenges you may be experiencing in advancing or enhancing your PLM environment. If you want, you can send us a note at my email address, which is on your invite page, and we'd be happy to hear from you. As always, phones will be muted during the presentation, but you can post your questions in the chat room, and we will answer them during the Q&A session. We will now begin our presentation with Ravi Dharmalingam.
Thank you, Kathy, and thanks to everybody for joining today's session. So today we will talk about, give a brief overview about the various options that are available to us to enhance the security of a Windchill environment. So we'll start with things that you can do to your out-of-the-box directory server, if that's what you're using to manage users, how you could add password policies to the directory server. Another option could be on how you could connect your Windchill system to a corporate LDAP system. And then we would look at different authentication schemes and the pros and cons of each of them. And then we'll finally look at how you could potentially use a single sign-on solution with Windchill. So we'll start with things that you could do if you are using the standard directory server that ships with Windchill for managing your user accounts, how you could add various security functions to it. So the directory server supports allowing you to add various password policies that allow you to define the strength of the user password, such as length of password, number of unique characters that need to be in there, and also to lock out an account if there are repeated failures, and or also set an expiration period for the password, so that users have to change their passwords periodically. So all these rules can be configured within the Windchill directory server, and we'll explain how you can use those. So essentially, you set up those rules using the DS config command line tool that comes with the directory server. And you can apply the policies either globally, that applies to all user accounts in the directory server, or you could target it for specific users or groups. And password validators can be defined, as we mentioned earlier, for various categories, for password length, for character uniqueness, or based on history and so on. And then you could aggregate rules based on combining different password validators. So for example, if you wanted to create a password rule that said that your users had to have a password of a minimum of 8 characters, and it also needed to have at least one of the following characters in the password, you could create a length validator as well as a character validator within WindchillDS, and then add both those validators to the policy. So essentially, the WindchillDS will enforce that the password has a minimum of 8 characters and also complies with, has a minimum number of characters as specified in the character validator. So if you're using WindchillDS, you could enable password change option in Windchill using the following property, and once you enable that, individual users can go to their profile and do an edit password to change their passwords. So if you have rules configured, like we mentioned earlier, if they attempt to change their password and the password does not comply with the rules, Windchill will report the error messages that it gets from WindchillDS. So you will get the error messages based on the rules that are configured in DS in Windchill. So So there are a few things that have to be done outside of Windchill. So though you can use WindchillDS to set up a lockout policy, so you can define that you want to lock out a user account if a user has entered the password wrong for more than 3 times or 5 times, there is no function in Windchill to go and unlock the account. So you need to have some processes defined outside of Windchill where an administrator can log into DS and unlock an account. So one of the things that you can use is a notification policy. So essentially, WindchillDS has a notification policy where you can map an SMTP server, and it will basically send email notifications to users whose password is about to expire, whose account is locked out, and so on. So they know that if they're trying to log in and they're unable to log into their account, so they know what happened to the account. And then they can contact the administrator to get their accounts fixed. So the other option is you could also add some more meaningful messages to the HTTP error messages that are displayed HTTP 500 and 401. When a user account is locked out, typically the system would throw a HTTP 500. So if you add some more links in there for the user to validate if their account is locked out, that would come in handy at that point. So as we discussed earlier, another option here obviously is to use your enterprise LDAP. And when you do that, you're basically using your standard corporate password management policies. And so as far as Windchill, the only requirement for using an enterprise LDAP is the user account that's defined has to match whatever you have in Windchill. And there are 2 options here as well. You could connect Windchill directly to your corporate LDAP using a JNDI adapter, and then connect Apache using the auth Windchill conf. And so in that case, both Apache and Windchill are reading the user information from the same location. Sometimes this might not be the ideal solution for some customers, depending on how complex your Active Directory or your corporate LDAP structure is, or you might have multiple directory servers, and it might be fairly difficult to have Windchill point to all those different directory servers. So in that case, there is another option where you could just point Apache to the directory server and still manage all Windchill user accounts in your local directory server. It obviously is some extra work. You have to keep the user accounts in the Windchill directory server as well. But the advantage here is basically you could have changes that are happening in your corporate LDAP with nodes being shifted or things like that. And typically that would not affect Windchill, because Windchill is not aware of any of the changes that are happening in your corporate LDAP structure. And as long as Apache can authenticate the user based on the URL that's specified in the Apache configuration file, and Windchill just requires the remote user name to match whatever is defined in the directory server. So this could be a preferred option for some customers. So next we'll talk about different authentication schemes. So Windchill basically relies entirely on the web server, or if you're using a J2EE container for the authentication framework. So Windchill does not have any other layers of authentication that it needs to process. So the main information Windchill needs from the web server really is the remote user variable. So when you make a request that requires authentication, the HTTP servlet request essentially has to get the remote user ID, and then Windchill needs to match that username to a valid user account in the system. So we'll talk about some of the schemes. The basic authentication is basically the standard HTTP basic authentication scheme. This is the out-of-the-box mechanism. This is what Apache is mapped out of the box. Essentially, this transmits username and password in clear text. And so this is basically a big security issue. If you're using this with standard HTTP, if anybody can get to your network and get the traffic, I mean, the username and password can be easily decoded. And it's not encrypted, it's just using a simple base64 encoding, which can be easily decrypted. So, so one of the, I think if you're using HTTP basic authentication, primarily it goes without saying that you have to use HTTPS if you want to make the password. I mean, if you want to make the environment more secure. And so one other drawbacks of this scheme is the HTTP basic authentication essentially caches the username and password on the browser session. So the browser session has the username and password, and it's a stateless protocol. So if a user leaves their browser on and there is no proper mechanisms to protect a particular machine, somebody else could get to that system. So this is one of the major drawbacks. Essentially, there is no automatic log off of the session, and if you do not close your browser, somebody else can access that information using the passwords that are stored in the browser cache. So form-based authentication is actually becoming quite popular now, partly because of this issue. I mean, essentially, form-based authentication provides for a mechanism to track the session of the user and then to set automatic expiration period. I mean, this is similar to what you typically see when you log into your bank accounts and so on, where the browser expires after some period of time. So using form-based authentication, you can create a framework like that for Windchill. And to implement form-based authentication, you could use Apache, or you could also use some other third-party tools to implement form-based authentication. But with Apache, you need to use the mod auth form module and configure form-based authentication. So one other thing to notice, even with form-based authentication, the username and password is still sent as clear text, and you still need to use HTTPS to make sure the information transmitted is encrypted. So NTLM authentication, again, this is for Windows-only environments. This is a good scheme. I mean, essentially, it uses Windows challenge response-based authentication mechanism. And so one of the things we have observed with NTLM is you need to note what the remote user that NTLM reports is. Sometimes it includes a domain prefix, and if it includes that, you have to make sure the user accounts defined in Windchill match what NTLM accounts returns on the web server. One other thing to note is actually Microsoft now recommends Kerberos over NTLM, because NTLM is a little outdated, and it does not support some of the newer cryptographic standards. So yeah, if your site, if your company has a Kerberos ticketing-based system, that could be another approach to look at. But right now, you might need to do some validation on some tools like desktop integration and things like that to make sure those work with Kerberos. I don't think Kerberos is still officially supported with Windchill. Another option, obviously, is using single sign-on, and SiteMinder is one of the popular options we've seen. With the single sign-on solution, essentially, you would install a SiteMinder web agent where your web server is, and it basically talks to your policy server, and the Windchill requests for logging into Windchill are essentially routed to the SiteMinder policy server, and it basically determines whether you get authenticated or not. Again, going back to the previous note, as far as Windchill is concerned, it's looking just for the remote user variable. It doesn't care about how SiteMinder is processing the authentication. You need to make sure the system that you are choosing has the SiteMinder modules to install for the web agent, and also make sure to test some of the third-party, some of the non-browser Windchill clients like Workgroup Manager and DTI to make sure they are working fine. So one other advantage of SiteMinder could be possibly you could use the SiteMinder Federation to bring in your suppliers and vendors into a single sign-on framework using SAML and other standards. With that, I turn it over to Kathy.
Thank you, Ravi, for that information. We will now begin the Q&A session for questions that you posted in the chat room. And as we transition to Q&A, there should be a poll on your screen, and we certainly appreciate if you would respond to that for us, and we'll give you a few moments to answer as we read the first question. Starting with the questions now, the first question is, can you give an example of a non-browser client?
Yeah, DTI, desktop integration, is one of them.
Okay, thank you. Number two, if you are using single sign-on, can you still log in as organizer admin or WC CAD admin, Windchill admin?
Yeah, essentially you need to make sure your single sign-on or SiteMinder server is mapped both to the your corporate LDAP as well as to Windchill directory servers. If you have these accounts defined in the local directory server, you need to make sure SiteMinder is mapped to both the corporate LDAP as well as the local LDAP.
Okay, and the third question, when considering the administration of disconnected users, what is your best practice recommendation?
So again, as we said, I think one of the things we observed with disconnected users, if you're seeing a lot of that, it's partly because there are possibly people being moved in your Active Directory to your node structure in your Active Directory being constantly updated. What we have recommended for some customers who have a lot of changes going on in Active Directory is to use the hybrid approach that we talked about. Essentially, you use your corporate LDAP for your password management by just mapping it to Apache, but you manage your user accounts in the local DS, and so this helps you from having a lot of disconnected principals in the principal admin.
Thank you so much, Ravi. That concludes our Q&A session. Thank you for your questions and your participation, everyone. If you have a topic you'd like covered in our Quick Bites, you can submit it via the link on our invite page. As always, you can view all our Quick Bites on our webpage at quickbytes.windchill360.com and register for our future topics as well. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again for attending. Bye-bye.